Malika Diallo thought no one would ever see her like this. Standing in the silent kitchen, hands trembling as she scooped cold leftovers into her mouth, swallowing hunger she had hidden for days. The house was supposed to be asleep. The world was supposed to stay blind. But in the dim hallway, Kwame Mensah stood frozen, his two children beside him, watching the woman they trusted break in quiet desperation. No accusation was spoken, no footsteps moved, only the sound of shame filled the space. And in that moment, everything they thought they knew about her began to change. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to the channel. The morning sun rose gently over Accra, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet streets. But inside, Malika Diallo's world warmth was something she had long learned to live without. Not because she did not crave it, but because life had taught her that comfort was never promised to people. Like her people who woke before dawn, not out of discipline but necessity, who measured their days not in hours but in how much strength they could stretch from an empty stomach. Malika adjusted the simple scarf wrapped neatly around her head as she stepped off the crowded trotro. Her shoes worn thin from months of walking distances, she never complained about her posture straight, despite the quiet exhaustion that lived deep inside her bones, because she had learned something very early in life. If you carried your pain with dignity, the world would at least hesitate before stepping on it. The mansion stood at the end of a long gated driveway, tall white walls reflecting wealth so effortlessly that it almost felt unreal to someone like Malika, who had grown up in a one-room home where rain could find its way through the roof and settle into corners like an uninvited guest. And yet every morning she walked through those gates, not as someone who belonged, but as someone who had no choice but to survive inside a world that was never built for her. Inside, everything was polished, silent, controlled. The marble floors reflected light so clearly that it sometimes made Malika conscious of every step she took, as though the house itself was watching, judging, measuring whether she deserved to stand there. And perhaps that feeling was not entirely imagined, because Madame Afua, the house manager, was always watching her sharp eyes, following Malika, with the quiet suspicion of someone who believed that poverty was not just a condition, but a flaw. "Don't forget," Madame Afua said that morning without looking directly at her. Her voice firm, practiced Mr. Mensah, does not like noise before breakfast. The children must be ready on time. Everything must be clean. No mistakes. Malika nodded softly. "Yes, Ma." She never argued, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something more important. People, like Madame Afua, did not want explanations, they wanted control. Kwame Mensah was already awake. He stood near the large glass window in the living room, dressed in a crisp shirt. His posture composed, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through something on his phone. A man whose life moved in structured decisions and measured outcomes. A man who had built wealth, lost love, and learned to keep everything else at a distance. He barely glanced at Malika when she entered. "Good morning, sir," she said gently. A slight nod, nothing more. That was how it had always been between them, respectful, distant, functional. But the children were different. Kojo ran toward her the moment he saw her, his small feet echoing across the polished floor. His laughter breaking through the stiffness of the house like sunlight forcing its way through a closed curtain. "Malika," he shouted, wrapping his arms around her waist. She smiled, and for a brief moment the weight inside her chest eased. "Good morning, Kojo," she said, kneeling slightly to meet his height. Amma stood a little farther away, watching quietly. She had her mother's eyes, deep, observant, carrying a kind of sadness that did not belong to a child her age, and while Kojo expressed everything openly, Amma held her emotions carefully, as if afraid they might spill into something she could not control. Malika approached her slowly. "Good morning, Amma," she said softly. Amma hesitated, then gave a small nod. It was progress. Every day it was small progress, and Malika never rushed it. Breakfast was always prepared with precision toast arranged neatly, fruit sliced evenly. Tea served at the exact temperature Madame Efua preferred, because in a house like this, even the smallest details carried weight and mistakes were not forgiven easily. Malika moved quietly, efficiently, her presence almost invisible, unless needed. And yet in the spaces between tasks, she noticed everything. The way Kwame rarely sat with the children for long. The way Amma sometimes stared at empty spaces, as if remembering something she could not bring back. The way Kojo laughed louder than necessary, as if trying to fill a silence that had grown too big. Malika did not ask questions, but she understood. Pain had a language, and she had learned to recognize it without words. Later that afternoon, as the children played in the garden, Malika sat beside them, guiding Kojo through a small reading exercise, while Amma quietly drew shapes in the sand, her fingers tracing patterns that seemed more like thoughts than games. "You're getting better," Malika told Kojo gently. "I want to be the best," he said proudly. "You already are," she smiled. Amma looked up briefly, watching them. Then she spoke, her voice soft. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question was simple, but it carried something heavier underneath. Malika paused for a moment. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I will be here." Amma nodded slowly, as if holding on to that answer like something fragile. From the balcony above, Kwame watched. He had not intended to stay. He had come outside for a call, for a moment of air, for anything that would not remind him of the emptiness that still lived inside the house. But instead, he found himself standing there, watching a scene that felt unfamiliar. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was something he had not seen in a long time. Ease, gentleness, connection. Malika did not know she was being watched. She laughed softly at something Kojo said, adjusted Amma's dress without thinking, her movements natural, unforced, as if caring for them was not a job, but something that came from a place deeper than obligation. Kwame frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, because he had hired many nannies before, and they had all done their jobs, but none of them had made the house feel different. He turned away before the thought could settle. That kind of thinking led to attachment, and attachment led to loss. He had learned that lesson once. He did not intend to learn it again. Inside, Madame Efua stood by the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed as she watched Malika through the glass. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence was not empty. It was calculating. Because in her experience, people like Malika always came with stories. And stories, she believed, were often just another way of hiding something. As the day slowly moved toward evening, the mansion remained beautiful, orderly, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But beneath that calm surface, something had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Like the first crack in something that had always seemed unbreakable. And Malika, without knowing it, had already become part of that change. The days in Kwame Mensah's mansion followed a rhythm so precise that it almost felt mechanical. Yet within that rhythm, something subtle had begun to change. Something no one announced and no one fully acknowledged, but something that could be felt in the way the children moved, in the way silence no longer pressed so heavily against the walls, in the way Malika Diallo's presence had started to settle into the house like a quiet, steady heartbeat. Amma was the first to change. It was not sudden, not something that could be pointed at in a single moment and named, but rather a gradual softening, like a tightly closed door, opening just enough to let light slip through, and Malika noticed it in the smallest details, the way Amma began sitting closer. During story time, the way her eyes lingered a little longer instead of drifting away. The way her voice, though still quiet, carried less hesitation when she spoke. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm shades of orange and gold, Malika sat on the edge of Amma's bed, holding a small storybook in her hands, her voice calm and gentle as she read each word slowly, allowing the rhythm of the story to wrap around the child like a blanket. And the little bird kept flying. Malika read softly even when the storm was strong, because she knew the sky would clear again. Amma stared at the ceiling for a moment, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "Did it really clear?" she asked quietly. Malika paused. "Yes," she said after a moment, her voice steady but warm. "It always does. Sometimes it just takes time." Amma turned her head slightly, her eyes searching Malika's face as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Then slowly, she shifted closer. Not much, just enough. But it was enough. Malika did not react in any dramatic way. She did not reach out suddenly or speak too much. She simply continued reading, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. Because she understood something important. Trust was not something you demanded. It was something you earned in silence. Outside the room, Kwame stood in the hallway. He had come to check on the children, as he often did. But he had stopped when he heard Malika's voice, soft and steady, carrying a kind of calm that he had not realized the house had been missing. He leaned slightly against the wall, listening. "The storm cannot last forever." Malika continued, turning the page gently. Kwame closed his eyes for a brief second. It was a simple story, a child's story, but the words felt heavier than they should have. Because he knew storms that had not cleared. He knew silence that had not softened. And yet inside that room, something about the way Malika spoke made it sound possible. He stepped away before he could think too much about it. Distance was safer. It always had been. Downstairs, Madame Afua moved through the kitchen with controlled precision, her hands busy, her mind sharper than her movements suggested. Because while others might have seen only a nanny doing her job, Madame Afua saw something else. Entirely, she saw influence. And influence in a house like this was never neutral. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Malika quietly made her way to the kitchen to clean up the last of the dishes. Her movements careful, almost silent, as though she were trying not to disturb the air itself. The kitchen was immaculate as always. Large counters, polished surfaces, neatly arranged utensils, everything in its place, everything abundant. Too abundant. Malika's eyes lingered for a moment on a tray of food, left from dinner. Rice, vegetables, pieces of chicken untouched, prepared in excess as was common in wealthy homes where having more than enough was considered normal, expected, almost necessary. She looked away quickly. It was not her place. She reminded herself of that constantly. Not her place to think about it. Not her place to question it. Not her place to want anything from it. Still, something inside her tightened, because she knew what that food meant outside these walls. She knew how many meals it could become, how many days it could stretch, how many people it could save from going to bed hungry. But here it would likely be thrown away, disposed of without thought, without consequence. Malika swallowed quietly and returned to her work. Upstairs, Kojo shifted in his sleep. Amma lay awake. Her eyes were open, staring into the dim light of the room, her mind restless in a way she did not fully understand. Because grief did not always come loudly. Sometimes it sat quietly, like a shadow that refused to leave. She slipped out of bed. Her small feet moved softly across the floor as she made her way toward the hallway, drawn by something she could not name. Downstairs, Malika hummed faintly to herself as she wiped the last plate, the sound barely audible, but warm human grounding. Amma paused at the edge of the staircase. She watched, not stepping forward, not calling out, just watching. Malika did not notice her. She continued working, unaware that in that quiet moment she was being seen. Not as a worker, not as someone hired, but as something else, entirely. Something closer. Something that Amma had been missing, without knowing how to ask for it. Kojo appeared behind his sister, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Amma did not answer. She simply pointed. Kojo looked. He tilted his head slightly. "Malika is always here," he said softly, as if stating something obvious. Amma nodded slowly. But for her it was not obvious. It was important. Very important. Because people who were always there were rare in her world. And she had learned too early that they could disappear. Upstairs, Kwame stepped out of his room. He noticed the children first. "What are you doing awake?" he asked, his voice low but firm. They turned quickly. Amma hesitated. "We were just—" she began, then stopped. Kwame followed their gaze. His eyes landed on Malika in the kitchen. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kwame exhaled slowly. "Go back to bed," he said. The children obeyed. But as Amma walked past him, she glanced back one last time, as if she were memorizing something. Kwame remained where he stood for a few seconds longer, watching, thinking. Then he turned away, back into his room, back into his distance. But something had shifted, not loudly, not clearly, but undeniably. Because for the first time he had not just seen Malika as an employee. He had seen her as part of the space his children were beginning to depend on. And that realization unsettled him, more than he was willing to admit. Downstairs, Malika finished her work, dried her hands, and stood still for a moment. The house was quiet again. Perfect, controlled, untouched. But inside her chest, something felt heavier than usual. Not pain, not exactly, just something she could not name. She shook her head slightly and reached for her bag. Another day completed, another day survived, and tomorrow she would return again. Because that was what she did, no matter what. She showed up, even when no one saw, even when no one understood, even when she herself was slowly running out of strength. Beyond the polished gates of Kwame Mensah's mansion, beyond the quiet order and controlled beauty of a world where nothing was ever missing, Malika Diallo's life existed in a different rhythm entirely, one that did not follow schedules or comfort, but survival, a rhythm that demanded something from her every single day, something she could never afford to refuse. Her neighborhood sat on the edge of the city where the roads were uneven and dust rose easily with every passing motorbike, where buildings leaned slightly, as if tired from standing too long, and where people did not ask whether life was hard, because hardship was already understood, already shared, without needing to be spoken aloud. Malika stepped down from the trotro that evening, with slower movements than usual, her body carrying the weight of a long day, her stomach tightening in quiet discomfort, a familiar emptiness that had become part of her routine, something she no longer reacted to with surprise, only endurance. The small compound she lived in was crowded, voices overlapping from different rooms, children playing in the narrow space between doors, women cooking over open flames, the smell of food filling the air in a way that was both comforting and cruel, because it reminded her of something she could not always have. She greeted people as she passed. A nod, a soft smile, always polite, always composed. Because even here where everyone struggled, dignity still mattered. Her room was at the far end of the compound, small, simple. A thin mattress laid carefully on the floor, a plastic chair, a small table with a kettle that did not always work, and a single window that let in more dust than air, but it was enough. It had to be enough. As soon as she stepped inside, her shoulders dropped slightly, the careful posture she maintained throughout the day, easing just a little because this was the only place where she did not have to perform strength, where she could simply exist, even if only for a few hours. A soft cough came from the corner. Ibrahima, she moved quickly. Her younger brother lay on the mattress, his body thinner than it should have been. His face pale with exhaustion, his breathing uneven in a way that made Malika's chest tighten every time she noticed it. "I'm here," she said gently, kneeling beside him. He opened his eyes slowly. "You're late," he whispered. "I had work," she replied softly, brushing his forehead with the back of her hand, checking for heat, the way she always did. He tried to smile. "You always have work," Malika forced a small smile in return. "And that is a good thing," she said. "It means we are still moving forward." He did not argue. He rarely did, because both of them understood that moving forward did not always mean things were getting better. Sometimes it only meant they had not fallen completely apart yet. Malika reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic container. Inside, there was just a little rice, not enough for two. She hesitated for a moment. Then she handed it to him. "Eat," she said. "What about you?" Ibrahima asked. "I already ate at work," she lied gently. He looked at her for a moment as if trying to read something in her face. But Malika had practiced this expression for years, calm, steady, convincing. He nodded and began to eat slowly. Malika watched him, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her stomach tightening with each movement he made. But she did not look away, because seeing him eat mattered more than anything she could have taken for herself. Outside, voices continued. Life continued. Inside the small room, silence settled gently between them. After a while, Ibrahima spoke again. "The landlord came today." Malika's expression did not change. "What did he say?" "He said we have one more week." "1 week?" Malika nodded slowly. "All right," she said. She did not ask for more details. She did not react with panic, because panic did not solve anything. It only made breathing harder. Instead, she stood up and moved toward the small table, pouring water into a cup and drinking slowly, allowing it to fill the space where food should have been a habit she had developed, not out of choice, but necessity. Later that night, after Ibrahima had fallen asleep, Malika sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the dark outside, her thoughts moving quietly, but heavily. She thought about the rent, about the medicine he needed, about the money she had already sent back to their grandmother in the village, who depended on her just as much. There was no space for mistakes, no space for weakness. Everything she did had to hold. Everything had to work. And yet, no matter how careful she was, it never seemed to be enough. Her stomach tightened again, sharper this time. She closed her eyes briefly. It would pass. It always did. She had learned how to wait through hunger, how to breathe through it, how to continue functioning, even when her body asked for something she could not give. Because stopping was not an option. The next morning came too quickly. Malika woke before sunrise, her body still heavy, her head slightly light from lack of food. But she moved anyway because there was no room in her life for hesitation. She dressed carefully, washed her face, adjusted her scarf, everything in place, everything controlled. By the time she stepped out of the compound, she was no longer the woman who had sat by the window the night before. She was composed again, steady again, ready to step back into a world where her struggles were invisible. The trotro ride felt longer that morning, the noise louder, the heat heavier. But Malika sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes focused ahead because she had trained herself to move through discomfort without reacting to exist inside it, without letting it define her outwardly. When she arrived at the mansion, everything was exactly as it had been the day before. Clean, ordered, untouched, a different world entirely. She stepped inside. "Good morning," she said softly. Madame Afua glanced at her briefly. "You are on time," she said. "Good," Malika nodded. Always on time, always correct. Because she understood something very clearly. This job was not just work. It was survival, Every plate she washed, every word she spoke, every mistake she avoided, it all mattered. Because somewhere behind all of it was Ibrahima, was rent, was the fragile line between staying afloat and losing everything. As she moved through the house preparing breakfast, setting the table, checking on the children, she carried all of that with her. Quietly, silently, unseen, and in the kitchen as she passed by trays of fresh food, more than enough for everyone in the house, her eyes lingered for just a second longer than usual. Not out of greed, not out of temptation, but out of something far deeper. Need. Real. Unavoidable. Need. She looked away, quickly, because she still believed in one thing above everything else. No matter how hard life became, no matter how empty her body felt, she would not lose her dignity. Not here, not like this, not yet. But something inside her was beginning to weaken. Not her character, not her values, but her strength. And strength, when pushed too far, did not break loudly. It simply ran out. In the weeks that followed, something quietly remarkable unfolded inside Kwame Mensah's mansion. Something that no one had planned, no one had announced, and yet everyone in their own way began to feel. Because change does not always arrive with noise or disruption. Sometimes it settles slowly, gently, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. And at the center of that change was Malika Diallo. It showed first in Kojo. He laughed more freely now, his voice echoing through the halls in a way that no longer felt out of place, as though the house had finally remembered what it meant to hold joy without restraint. And he followed Malika everywhere, asking questions, telling stories, holding on to her presence with the unfiltered trust that only a child could give. "Malika, look," he shouted one afternoon, holding up a drawing filled with uneven shapes and bright colors. She knelt beside him, her eyes soft with genuine interest. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's us," he explained proudly. "That's me, that's Amma, and that's you." Malika paused for a brief second. "And where is your father?" she asked gently. Kojo hesitated. Then he pointed to a corner of the page where a figure stood slightly apart. "He is there," he said. Malika smiled, but something in her chest tightened. Not from judgment, but from understanding. Because children did not lie in drawings. They revealed what words could not. Amma, on the other hand, changed differently. Her progress was slower, quieter, but perhaps deeper. She no longer avoided Malika's presence. Instead, she began seeking it in small, almost invisible ways, sitting closer. During meals, lingering near the kitchen when Malika worked, asking simple questions that carried more meaning than they appeared to. "Can I help you?" Amma asked one evening, standing near the counter. Malika looked at her surprised. "Of course," she said softly. "You can pass me the plates." Amma did so carefully, her small hands steady, her expression focused as if the task itself mattered deeply, and in that moment, Malika understood something that went beyond words. This was not about plates. This was about belonging. Across the room, Madame Efua watched, her lips pressed into a thin line. Because what she saw was not just a nanny doing her job. She saw influence, and influence in her mind was something dangerous when it came from someone of Malika's background. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Kojo spoke animatedly. Amma responded, even if only in short sentences. And for a brief moment, it almost resembled something whole. Kwame noticed. He always noticed, but he did not immediately acknowledge it. Instead, he observed quietly, his eyes moving from one detail to another, analyzing, measuring, questioning. "Your drawing was good," he said suddenly to Kojo. Kojo beamed. Malika said the same thing. Kwame's gaze shifted slightly. Toward Malika. She lowered her eyes respectfully. "It was a very thoughtful drawing," she said. Kwame nodded once, but his expression remained guarded, because recognition for him was never simple. It came with caution, with hesitation, with the weight of past loss pressing against every new possibility. After dinner, as Malika cleared the table, Amma lingered nearby. "Will you tell me another story tonight?" she asked quietly. Malika smiled. "Yes," she said, "if you like." Amma nodded. "I like." From across the room, Auntie Abena, who had arrived earlier that day, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. She had greeted Malika politely when she first arrived, but her politeness carried a certain sharpness, the kind that came from someone who had already made up her mind before speaking. Later, when Kwame stepped into his study, Abena followed. "You need to be careful," she said without preamble. Kwame looked up. "About what that girl?" Abena replied, her tone firm. "The nanny." Kwame leaned back slightly. "She is doing her job. That is exactly the problem," Abena said. "She is doing it too well." Kwame frowned faintly. "I don't see how that is a problem." Abena crossed her arms. "Children become attached. You become comfortable. And then one day something happens and everything falls apart. I have seen it before." Kwame's expression hardened slightly. "This is different." Abena shook her head. "It is never different," she said. "People from that background always come with something, a need, a story, a hidden intention." Kwame did not respond immediately, because part of him wanted to dismiss her words. But another part, the part shaped by experience and loss, could not ignore them completely. "I am aware," he said finally. Abena studied him for a moment. "Are you?" she asked quietly. Back in the kitchen, Malika stood alone for a moment after finishing her work, her hands resting lightly on the counter as she allowed herself a brief pause, something she rarely did because stopping often meant feeling, and feeling was something she had learned to manage carefully. Her stomach tightened again, a familiar sensation, stronger now. She glanced toward the dining table where plates still held small portions of untouched food. Not much, but enough. She looked away quickly. Her hands moved automatically, gathering the plates, stacking them neatly, preparing to clean, to remove, to restore order as she always did. Because that was her role. That was her place. And she had never crossed that line. Not once. Upstairs, Amma waited in her room, sitting on the bed with quiet anticipation, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as she listened for footsteps in the hallway. When Malika entered carrying the small storybook, Amma's face softened in a way that no one else in the house ever saw. "You came," she said. "I said I would," Malika replied gently. She sat beside her and began to read. The story was simple, a journey, a struggle, a quiet victory. Amma listened closely, her eyes fixed on Malika, not just on the book, but on her face. Her voice, the way she made the words feel real. "Do you think people always get through hard things?" Amma asked suddenly. Malika paused. She could have given an easy answer, a comforting lie. But she did not. "I think," she said slowly, "that people learn how to keep going, even when things don't become easy." Amma considered this. Then she nodded, as if that answer made sense to her. Downstairs, Madame Afua stood by the kitchen again, her eyes lingering on the space Malika had just left, her mind working quietly, carefully. Because in her view, this was no longer just about a nanny. It was about boundaries. And boundaries once crossed were not easily restored. She turned away slowly, already planning, already deciding. Because in a house like this, change was not always welcomed, and sometimes it was stopped before it could fully take root. Unaware of all of this, Malika continued reading upstairs, her voice steady, her presence calm, her care genuine. But inside her something continued to grow. Not ambition, not expectation, but connection. And connection in a place built on distance was never simple. It was fragile, it was dangerous, and it was already beginning to change everything. The morning began, like any other in Kwame Mensah's mansion. quiet, orderly, carefully controlled. Yet beneath that surface, something unseen had already started to shift. Something that would not announce itself loudly, but would reveal itself through tension, through small fractures that no one could ignore once they appeared. It started with a call from Amma's school. Malika was in the kitchen arranging breakfast when Madame Afua's voice cut through the air sharper than usual. "Malika, come here." She wiped her hands quickly and stepped forward. "Yes, Ma, get the children ready immediately. Mr. Mensah needs to go to the school. There has been an issue." Malika's chest tightened slightly. "What kind of issue?" Madame Afua gave her a look that dismissed the question. "Just do as you're told." Within minutes, the house moved from calm to urgency footsteps, quicker voices lower, but more tense. The kind of controlled disruption that came from a problem no one wanted to fully name. Kwame was already at the door, his expression firm, his movements efficient, but there was something in his eyes that Malika had not seen before. Concern. Not the distant, measured concern of a man managing a situation, but something deeper, more personal. Amma stood beside him, unusually silent, her small hands clenched tightly at her sides, while Kojo looked between them, confused, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. Malika approached carefully. "Sir," she said gently, "may I come with you?" Kwame hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. "Yes." The drive to the school was quiet. The city moved as it always did. Busy, loud, alive, but inside the car, everything felt contained, as if the outside world had been muted. Amma sat still, her gaze fixed on her lap. Malika sat beside her, not speaking, not forcing, just present. Because she understood that sometimes presence was more powerful than words. At the school, they were led into a small office where a teacher and a counselor waited, their expressions polite, but strained, the kind of expressions people wore when they were about to discuss something uncomfortable. "Mr. Mensah," the counselor began, "thank you for coming so quickly." Kwame nodded once. "What happened?" The teacher exchanged a glance with the counselor before speaking. "It's Amma," she said gently. "She had an incident this morning." Kwame's posture stiffened slightly. "What kind of incident?" Amma's fingers tightened further. Malika noticed. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand over Amma's, not gripping, not forcing, just resting there, a quiet gesture of support. Amma did not pull away. She became very distressed during class, the teacher continued. Another student mentioned mothers, and Amma reacted strongly. She started crying, then shouting. She said things that concerned us. Kwame's jaw tightened. What did she say? The counselor spoke this time. She said her mother left because she wasn't good enough. Silence filled the room, heavy, unavoidable. Kwame looked at Amma, but she did not look back. Her eyes remained down, her body tense, as if she were bracing for something. Disappointment, correction, distance. Malika felt her chest tighten, not from surprise, but from recognition, because she had heard those words before, in different voices, in different situations, but always carrying the same weight. "I didn't mean it," Amma whispered suddenly, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to shout." Kwame opened his mouth, but no words came. Because in that moment, all his usual responses, logic, control, solutions, felt insufficient. Malika spoke instead, softly. "You were hurt." She said, her voice calm, steady, and sometimes when we are hurt, it comes out louder than we expect. Amma's breathing slowed slightly. She glanced up just for a moment, meeting Malika's eyes, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them. Understanding, acceptance, without judgment. The counselor observed quietly. "This is not just about today," she said carefully. "Amma is carrying something that has not been processed. She needs support, consistent support." Kwame nodded. "I understand, but his voice lacked its usual certainty, because understanding something and knowing how to fix it were not the same. On the drive back home, Amma leaned slightly toward Malika. Just slightly, but enough. Malika adjusted her position to support her without making it obvious, her hand resting gently near Amma's shoulder, her presence steady. Kwame noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, but this time, he did not look away immediately. Instead, he watched, and what he saw unsettled him in a way he could not easily explain. Because his daughter, who had built walls even he could not reach, was leaning toward someone else, trusting someone else, and that realization carried two conflicting emotions at once: relief and fear. Back at the mansion, Madame Afua was waiting. "What happened?" she asked. Kwame's tone was controlled. "It is handled," but Malika saw the brief flicker of irritation in Madame Afua's eyes, not at the situation, but at being excluded from it. Later that afternoon, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. Amma stayed close to Malika, following her from room to room without speaking much, her presence like a shadow that did not want to be left behind. Kojo tried to lighten the mood, playing, talking, asking questions, but even he seemed aware that something had shifted. Malika guided them gently through the day, adjusting her tone, her energy, her presence to meet what they needed, not what was expected. And for the first time, Kwame did not retreat into his usual distance. Instead, he remained nearby, watching, observing, trying to understand something he had not allowed himself to confront before. That evening, as the children sat together in the living room, Amma resting quietly against Malika's side, Kwame stood at a distance. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You handled that well," he said suddenly. Malika looked up. "Thank you, sir." Kwame hesitated. Then he asked, "How did you know what to say?" Malika considered the question. "I didn't," she replied honestly. "I just listened." Kwame frowned slightly. "Listening does not solve problems." Malika met his gaze briefly. "Sometimes it does more than solving," she said gently. "Sometimes it helps people feel like they are not alone in the problem." Kwame did not respond immediately, because something about that answer unsettled the way he had always approached things. Fix, control, resolve, but not feel. He looked at Amma, then at Malika, and for the first time, a thought crossed his mind that he could not dismiss easily. Maybe what his children needed was not more solutions. Maybe they needed something he had not been able to give. Something Malika, without trying, seemed to carry naturally. Upstairs later that night, as Amma fell asleep more peacefully than she had in weeks, Malika sat quietly beside her, her hand resting lightly on the blanket, her presence calm grounding, but inside her, something else was happening. Her body was weaker, her energy thinner, her hunger sharper. She felt it in the slight tremor in her hands, in the way her head felt lighter than it should, in the quiet exhaustion that did not fully leave no matter how much she pushed through. But she ignored it, as she always did, because there were more important things, because stopping was not an option, because she had responsibilities that did not pause for her weakness. And so she stayed, she endured, she gave, even as something inside her was slowly, quietly beginning to run out. In a house where abundance was part of the architecture, where polished counters held more food than any single meal required, and refrigerators were stocked beyond necessity, it was almost impossible to imagine that hunger could exist within the same walls. And yet hunger does not always belong to places, it belongs to people. And Malika Diallo carried it with her every single day, quietly, invisibly, as though it were something she had learned to hide, even from herself. The kitchen was where that contrast lived most clearly. Every morning, trays of fresh bread arrived, warm and fragrant fruits arranged in perfect symmetry, juices poured into glass containers that caught the light beautifully. Everything prepared not just for nourishment but presentation. because in a house like this, even eating was an expression of status. Malika moved through the space with practiced efficiency. Her hands steady, her movements precise. But her senses were always aware. The smell of food, lingering longer than it should, the sight of untouched plates pressing against something inside her that she refused to name. "Be careful with that," Madame Afua said sharply one morning as Malika reached for a tray. "That is imported. It is not for waste." Malika nodded quickly. "Yes, ma." She adjusted her grip, her fingers tightening slightly, not from clumsiness but from the quiet tension that had begun to build inside her body, a tension that came from exhaustion, from lack, from pushing herself beyond what her body could comfortably endure. By midday, the children were in the living room, scattered toys around them, their laughter softer than usual but still present, still real. And Malika sat nearby helping Kojo with a small puzzle, while Amma leaned against her shoulder, her presence calm, almost dependent. "Why don't you eat with us?" Kojo asked suddenly, looking up. Malika smiled gently. "I eat later," she said. "But you always say that," he replied, frowning slightly. "When is later?" Malika hesitated for a brief moment. "After you," she said simply. Kojo seemed unconvinced, but Amma placed a hand on his arm. "She is busy," Amma said quietly. Kojo nodded, though his eyes lingered on Malika for a moment longer, as if trying to understand something that did not quite make sense to him. Across the room, Kwame watched. He had been reviewing documents on his tablet, but his attention had shifted, drawn by the simplicity of the question and the way Malika had answered it, because there was something in her tone, something subtle that suggested the answer was not as straightforward as it sounded. He made a mental note of it, not because he fully understood it yet, but because it stayed with him. Later that afternoon, as preparations for dinner began, the kitchen became busier, more active. The air filled with movement and instruction, and Malika worked alongside the other staff, her focus sharp, her energy controlled. Even as her body began to feel heavier, slower, her head occasionally light in a way that made her pause for just a second longer than usual. "Don't stand there," Madame Afua snapped at another worker. "Move faster." Her eyes shifted briefly to Malika. "And you finish those dishes before you leave." "Yes," Malika replied. She did not complain, she never did, because she understood that in this environment, endurance was not just expected, it was required. Dinner that evening was elaborate. Guests had been invited. Important people, the kind who expected perfection, and everything was prepared accordingly. Multiple dishes, rich flavors, careful presentation. More food than could possibly be consumed, because in this world, excess was not questioned. It was displayed. Malika moved quietly between the kitchen and the dining area, ensuring everything flowed smoothly, her presence almost invisible, yet essential to the order being maintained. She noticed the plates, how full they were when served, how much remained when cleared, pieces untouched, food barely tasted, entire portions left behind. Her stomach tightened again, sharper this time. She swallowed slowly, forcing her focus back to her tasks, because allowing herself to think about it would only make the feeling stronger. When the guests finally left and the house began to settle back into its usual quiet, the kitchen was left with the aftermath. Trays, plates, bowls filled with what remained. And what remained was more than enough. Much more. "Throw these away," Madame Afua instructed, gesturing toward a tray of leftover food. "They cannot be served again." Malika's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. "Yes, ma," she said. She began clearing the plates. Her movements slower now, not from hesitation, but from the growing weakness in her body, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but made everything just a little harder. As she carried the tray toward the disposal area, her vision blurred slightly. She stopped. Just for a second, breathed in, then out. It would pass. It always did. She continued. Upstairs, Amma stood at the top of the staircase, watching. She had woken up again, unable to sleep, drawn by something she could not explain. Kojo appeared beside her, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you here again?" he whispered. Amma did not answer. She was watching Malika. The way she moved, the way she paused. Something felt different. Something felt wrong. "Malika looks tired," Kojo said softly. Amma nodded. "Yes." Downstairs, Kwame stepped into the hallway, noticing the children again. "What are you doing awake?" he asked, his tone quieter this time. Amma pointed slightly. Kwame followed her gaze. His eyes landed on Malika, and this time he saw more than just movement. He saw the slight unsteadiness, the pause that lasted a little too long, the way her hand rested briefly on the counter as if grounding herself. Something shifted in his expression, not fully formed, not fully understood, but present. "Go back to bed," he said to the children. They obeyed, but slowly, reluctantly, because something about the moment felt important. Downstairs, Malika finished her work, her hands moving automatically, now guided more by habit than energy, her body functioning on something deeper than strength alone. When the last dish was cleaned and the kitchen restored to its perfect state, she stood still for a moment. The room was quiet again. Full, abundant, and yet she felt empty. Her stomach tightened once more, stronger, more persistent. She glanced just for a second toward the covered tray that had been set aside, not yet discarded. Her breath caught slightly. Then she looked away. No, she shook her head faintly. Not her place, not her right. She reached for her bag. Time to leave, time to return to her own world, where hunger had a reason, where nothing was wasted because nothing was ever enough. But as she stepped toward the door, her body swayed slightly. Just a small movement, barely noticeable. Except it was noticed. From the hallway, Kwame saw it, and this time he did not look away. He stood still, watching his mind beginning to connect pieces he had not fully examined before. The questions were forming now, slowly, quietly, but they were forming, and once questions begin, answers are never far behind. Unaware of his gaze, Malika steadied herself and walked out into the night. Her steps controlled her posture, straight, her dignity intact. But inside her, something was weakening. Not her spirit, not her will, but her body, and the body, unlike the heart, could only endure so much before it demanded to be heard. The arrival of Auntie Abena did not change the structure of the house, but it changed the air inside it. The kind of change that could not be measured in objects or routines, but could be felt in glances, in pauses, in the subtle tightening of conversations that had once flowed more freely, because some people do not need to speak loudly to shift a space. They carry authority in the way they observe, in the way they decide what belongs and what does not. Auntie Abena moved through Kwame Mensah's mansion with the confidence of someone who had always been part of it. Her presence firm, composed, her eyes sharp with a kind of judgment that rarely needed explanation, because it revealed itself in the smallest reactions, in the way her gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary on Malika, in the way her lips pressed together when she saw Amma leaning too comfortably against the young nanny's side. "She is getting too close," Abena said, one morning as she joined Kwame for tea in the sitting room, her tone calm but deliberate. Kwame did not look up immediately. "She is doing her job," he replied. Abena stirred her tea slowly. "A job has limits," she said. "Children should not confuse care with attachment." Kwame exhaled quietly. "They have already lost enough," he said. "If they feel comfort, I will not take it away." Abena's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what happens when that comfort leaves?" she asked. "Because it will. People like her do not stay forever." Kwame did not respond, not because he agreed, but because the thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Across the room, Malika moved quietly, arranging books and tidying small details that no one else noticed. Her posture steady, her expression calm. But inside her, there was a growing awareness of something she could not ignore anymore. She was being watched, not in the casual way of supervision, but in a more deliberate, more questioning way. Auntie Abena's eyes followed her movements with a quiet intensity that made even simple tasks feel heavier, as if each action was being measured, evaluated, interpreted for meaning beyond what it was. Malika lowered her gaze. She had experienced this before, in different places, with different people. That unspoken assumption that someone like her always carried something hidden, something suspicious, something waiting to be revealed. She continued her work, because she knew there was no argument that could change a belief already formed. Only time, only actions, and sometimes not even those were enough. Later that afternoon, as the children played in the garden, the tension became more visible. Kojo ran freely, his laughter bright, his energy uncontained, while Amma stayed close to Malika, her hand occasionally brushing against her arm, as if needing to confirm she was still there. Auntie Abena watched from the veranda. "Come here, Amma," she called. Amma hesitated. Her eyes shifted briefly to Malika, then back to Abena. "Come," Abena repeated, her tone firmer. Amma slowly walked toward her. Abena adjusted the girl's dress, smoothing it unnecessarily. "You must not always cling," she said quietly. "You are not a baby." Amma said nothing. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. Abena's gaze flicked briefly toward Malika. "You should learn to stand on your own." Malika felt the weight of those words. They were not meant only for Amma. But she did not react. She simply continued guiding Kojo's play, her voice steady, her movements calm, as if the moment had passed without meaning. But it had not. Moments like that never passed without meaning. They settled, they stayed, and they shaped what came next. That evening dinner was quieter than usual. The children spoke less. Kwame remained thoughtful, and Auntie Abena observed everything. When Malika served the plates, her movements were precise as always, but her body felt heavier, her energy thinner, her focus requiring more effort than it should. She had not eaten that day. Not properly. Only water, and a small piece of bread in the morning. Her stomach tightened again. A dull, persistent ache. She ignored it, as she always did. After dinner, as she cleared the table, Abena's voice cut through the quiet. "You can leave the rest," she said. "The other staff will handle it." Malika paused. "That is my responsibility," she replied gently. Abena tilted her head slightly. "Responsibility is not the same as necessity," she said. "You do not need to prove anything." Malika lowered her eyes. "I am only doing my work." Abena watched her for a moment longer. Then she nodded slightly. "Very well." But her expression did not soften. Because for her the issue was not about tasks. It was about presence, influence, position. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Malika returned to the kitchen to finish the last of the cleaning. Her movements slower, now her body more aware of its limits. Her strength stretched thinner than she allowed anyone to see. The kitchen once again held more food than it needed. Covered trays, unfinished plates, pieces untouched. She stood still for a moment. Just a moment, her eyes resting on the food, her breath slightly uneven. The thought came again, not new but stronger, clearer, more insistent. She swallowed, looked away. No, not her place, not her right. Upstairs, Amma lay awake. Again, her mind restless, her chest tight in a way she could not explain. She slipped out of bed quietly, moved toward the hallway, down the stairs, drawn by something she could not name. She reached the edge of the kitchen, and she saw Malika, standing still, not moving, not working, just standing. Amma frowned slightly. Something felt wrong. "Malika," she whispered. Malika turned quickly, startled. "Amma," she said softly. Why are you awake? Amma stepped closer. You look tired. Malika smiled gently. I am all right. Amma shook her head slightly. No. The word was small, but certain. Malika's smile faltered for just a second, then returned. I will be fine, she said. Amma studied her. Then slowly she reached for Malika's hand, held it. Not tightly, but firmly enough, as if trying to give something back, something she did not fully understand, but felt. Malika's chest tightened, not from pain, but from something else, something warmer, something that made the hunger feel different, not gone, but less alone. From the hallway, Kwame stood in the shadows, watching, again, and this time what he saw did not leave him with questions. It left him with something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because it was no longer just about a nanny doing her job. It was about a connection forming in a place where he had tried to keep everything controlled. Measured, safe, and control he was beginning to realize was slipping. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly, in ways that could not be undone easily. Downstairs, Malika gently guided Amma back upstairs, her steps careful, her voice soft, her presence steady, even as her body continued to weaken, even as the hunger inside her grew sharper, more persistent. And for the first time, the line she had never crossed before did not feel as distant as it once had. Not because she wanted to cross it. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It never did. Instead, it gathered, slowly, quietly, like a weight that increased without warning, until one day it became impossible to ignore. And for Malika Diallo, that weight had been building for weeks, carried in her body, in her thoughts, in every choice she made between what she needed and what she could afford to give up. By the time the next week began, her exhaustion had settled deeper. It was no longer something she could push aside easily. It showed in the way her hands trembled slightly when she lifted heavier trays, in the way her vision blurred for brief seconds when she stood too quickly in the way. Even simple movements required more effort than they should have. But she did not slow down. She could not. Because outside the mansion her world was tightening. That evening, when she returned to her compound, she knew something was wrong before she even reached her door. The voices were louder, sharpened, uncomfortable. Her steps quickened. Malika, someone called from across the compound. She turned. It was the landlord, standing near her door, waiting. Her stomach tightened. I was looking for you, he said, his tone already impatient. I just came back from work. She replied, her voice calm despite the tension rising inside her chest. That is not my concern, he said. Your rent is overdue. I told your brother already. 1 week has passed. Malika glanced briefly toward the door. Ibrahima stood just inside his expression, anxious, his body too weak to step forward but unwilling to stay hidden. I will pay, Malika said, when the landlord pressed. Soon, she answered. He laughed shortly. Soon is not a date, he said. You have 3 days. After that I lock the door. Simple. 3 days. The words settled heavily. Malika nodded slowly. I understand. He studied her for a moment, then turned and walked away. The compound returned to its usual noise. But for Malika, everything felt quieter, heavier. Inside the room, Ibrahima looked at her with guilt. I'm sorry, he said softly. You have nothing to be sorry for, she replied quickly, moving toward him. I should be working, he added. I should be helping. You are helping, Malika said firmly, by getting better. He shook his head weakly. I'm not getting better. The words hung in the air, unavoidable. Malika swallowed. You will, she said. But this time the words felt harder to say, because she was not sure anymore. She reached into her bag. There was very little inside. A few coins, not enough, not even close. Her chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, but something close. She stood up slowly. I will find a way, she said quietly. Ibrahima did not respond. because they both knew something she had not said aloud. There were not many ways left. That night, Malika did not sleep. She sat by the window again, her thoughts moving endlessly, calculating, reconsidering, searching for solutions that did not exist, because every option led to the same reality. She needed money, more than she had, more than she could easily get. Her stomach tightened again, stronger. She pressed her hand against it lightly, ignored it, because there were more important things. There always were. The next morning she left earlier than usual, walking faster, thinking harder. By the time she arrived at the mansion, she had already decided one thing: she would not fail, no matter what it cost her. Inside, the house moved as it always did, perfect, controlled, untouched. But Malika felt different inside it now, more aware, more strained. As she prepared breakfast, her hands moved automatically, but her mind remained elsewhere, counting, calculating, searching for a solution that still had not come. Kojo noticed first. "You are quiet today," he said. Malika smiled faintly. "Just thinking," she replied. About what he asked. She hesitated. "About how to make today a good day," she said gently. Kojo grinned. "It is already a good day." Amma watched quietly. She did not speak, but her eyes stayed on Malika longer than usual, because she saw something others did not. Something small, something subtle, but real. Kwame noticed it too. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to register. "You seem unwell," he said later, his tone neutral but observant. Malika straightened slightly. "I am fine, sir." Kwame held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. But he was not convinced, because something in her posture, in her voice, in the way she moved, suggested otherwise. Still, he said nothing more, because asking questions meant stepping into something he was not yet ready to confront. That evening, the house prepared for another large dinner. Guests again, more food, more excess, more of everything. Malika worked through it all, her energy. Thinner now, her body heavier, her focus slipping at moments she had to quickly recover from it, because mistakes were not allowed. Not here, not now, not when she needed this job more than ever. As the night progressed, the food continued to flow, dish after dish, plate after plate, more than enough, far more than enough, and Malika felt it, not just as hunger, but as something deeper, a growing tension between what existed and what was needed, between what was wasted and what could save her. By the time the guests left the kitchen, was once again filled with what remained. And what remained was overwhelming. Rice, meat, vegetables, entire portions untouched. Enough for days, enough for her, enough for Ibrahima. Her breath slowed, her eyes fixed on the trays. Her body still. The thought came again, stronger, clearer, more urgent. 3 days, she remembered. 3 days before they lost their home. Her stomach tightened sharply. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. She turned away. No, not yet. She moved toward the sink, started cleaning, focused on the task. But her hands were slower now, her strength thinner, her thoughts louder. Behind her, the food remained, unchanged, unneeded, waiting. And for the first time, the line she had held onto so tightly began to feel fragile. Not because her values had changed, but because her circumstances had. And circumstances, when pushed far enough, did not ask for permission. They demanded decisions. Malika continued working, but inside her, something had already shifted. Not visibly. Not yet. But enough. Enough to bring her closer to a moment she had spent her entire life avoiding. A moment where survival and dignity would stand face to face, and she would have to choose. That night the mansion fell into silence, the way it always did after a gathering. The echoes of laughter and conversation, fading into stillness, the polished floors reflecting nothing but soft light, the air returning to its usual controlled calm. And yet beneath that calm, something fragile had reached its limit. Malika Diallo stood alone in the kitchen. The last of the dishes had been washed, the counters wiped, everything restored to perfection, everything exactly as it should be. Except her. Her body felt heavier than it ever had. Not from work, not from exhaustion alone, but from something deeper, something her will could no longer fully hold back. Her stomach tightened again. This time it did not fade. It lingered, sharp, demanding. She placed her hand lightly against the counter, steadying herself, breathing in, then out. The kitchen was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no one watching. Or so she believed. Her eyes moved slowly, toward the tray, the one set aside, not yet discarded. Rice, pieces of chicken, vegetables, simple, unimportant to this house, everything to her. She looked away, closed her eyes. No, she whispered softly to herself, her voice barely audible. She stepped back, picked up a cloth, wiped a surface that was already clean. Her movements mechanical, controlled, as if repeating the action could silence the thought. But the thought did not leave. It returned, stronger, more urgent. Her body swayed slightly. A wave of dizziness passed through her. Her vision blurred for a moment. She gripped the counter harder, waited, breathed, but the feeling did not disappear. It stayed, persistent. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She opened her eyes again. The tray was still there, unchanged, waiting. She thought of Ibrahima, of his weak voice, of the landlord's words. 3 days, 3 days until they had nothing. Her throat tightened. She swallowed. Her hand moved, almost without permission. She reached for the tray, then stopped, her fingers hovering just above it, as if an invisible line still held her back. "This is not yours," she whispered. The words she had told herself her entire life. The rule she had never broken, but her body did not respond to rules anymore. It responded to need, real, immediate, unavoidable. Her hand trembled, then slowly lowered. She took a small portion, not much, just enough. Enough to quiet the pain, enough to keep going. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as if she were apologizing with every motion. She brought the food to her mouth, paused, for just a second, as if giving herself one last chance to stop. Then she ate, slowly, quietly. The first bite felt unfamiliar, not because of the taste, but because of what it meant. Her body reacted instantly, relief, warmth, strength returning even if only slightly. Her eyes closed briefly, not in pleasure, but in release. Because hunger, when it is constant, does not disappear dramatically. It softens gently, like something loosening its grip. She took another bite, then another. Still careful, still quiet, still unaware. Unaware that she was no longer alone. At the end of the hallway, hidden in the dim light, Kwame Mensah stood frozen. He had come downstairs for water. Nothing more. But he had stopped the moment he saw her. His eyes fixed on the scene before him. His mind trying to understand what he was seeing. Not theft, not greed, something else, something quieter, something heavier. Beside him, 2 small figures stood. Kojo, Amma. They had followed him. Curious, sleepy, unaware of what they were about to witness. Kojo tilted his head slightly. "Why is Malika eating like that?" He whispered. Kwame did not answer. Because he did not know how. Amma said nothing. Her eyes did not move. She watched Malika closely, not with confusion, but with something deeper. Recognition. Malika took another small bite, then stopped. Something shifted, not in the room, but inside her. That feeling, the one that tells you when you are being watched. Her body stilled, her breath slowed. She turned slowly, and saw them. For a moment, everything stopped. The tray in her hands, the food, the silence. Her eyes met Kwame's first, then the children's. And in that instant, something inside her broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The shame came first, sharp, immediate. Her hand moved instinctively, lowering the tray. Her throat tightened. Her body straightened as if posture alone could restore what had been lost. She began. But the words did not come, because there was nothing she could say that would make this moment smaller. Nothing that could undo what they had seen. Kojo looked confused. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly. The question was simple, innocent, but it cut deeper than any accusation. Malika's eyes filled slightly, but she did not let the tears fall. "I am sorry," she said instead. Her voice low, controlled, but trembling underneath. Kwame did not move, did not speak, because something inside him was shifting, rapidly, unexpectedly. This was not what he had assumed, not what he had been warned about. There was no greed in her eyes, no fear of being caught in wrongdoing, only something else, something he had not allowed himself to consider. Amma stepped forward slowly, her small hand reaching out. Not accusing, not questioning, just reaching. "Malika," she said quietly. Malika took a step back. "No," she said gently. "You should go back to bed." Her voice was steady again, but distant, as if she were already pulling away, already preparing for what would come next. Because she understood this world. Understood how quickly judgment formed, how easily people decided what something looked like and what it meant. Kwame finally spoke. "What are you doing?" The question was direct, but not harsh. Malika met his gaze, for the first time without lowering her eyes. And in that moment, there was no defense, no excuse. "Only truth. I was hungry," she said. Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Kwame's expression shifted slightly. Not anger, not disappointment. Something else, something more complicated. Kojo frowned. "But there is food," he said. Malika nodded slowly. "Yes." Amma's hand remained extended, still waiting, still offering something she could not fully explain. Malika hesitated, then gently took it, just for a moment, before releasing it again. "I am sorry," she repeated softly. Then she turned, placed the tray back, cleaned her hands, each movement controlled, measured, as if rebuilding herself piece by piece. Kwame watched, not speaking, because what he had just seen had changed something, irreversibly, not about her, but about everything he thought he understood. The children remained still. Amma's eyes followed Malika. Kojo looked between them, confused, trying to make sense of something that did not fit into his understanding of the world. And in that quiet kitchen, under soft light and heavy silence, a truth had been revealed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. A truth that could not be unseen. A truth that would change everything that came next. The house did not erupt the next morning. There was no shouting, no immediate punishment, no dramatic confrontation that shattered the silence of Kwame Mensah's mansion. And yet something far more unsettling settled into the air. Something quiet, something heavy, something that could be felt in the way. Footsteps softened in the way voices lowered, in the way eyes lingered just a little too long before turning away. Malika Diallo arrived earlier than usual, not because she had been told to, but because she needed to. She needed the extra minutes to prepare herself, to rebuild her composure, to step back into the role she had always maintained, calm, efficient, invisible. As she walked through the gates, her posture was as steady as ever, her expression composed, her scarf neatly adjusted, her movements controlled. Nothing, outwardly, had changed, but inside everything felt different, because she knew. She had been seen. And once something like that happened, there was no returning to before. Inside the house, the morning routines continued. Breakfast was prepared, the table was set, the children came down. Everything looked the same, but it did not feel the same. Kojo was the first to break the silence. "Malika," he said, his voice soft but curious. "Are you still hungry?" The question hung in the air. Simple, innocent, but impossible to ignore. Malika paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she smiled gently. "I am fine," she said. Kojo frowned slightly. But yesterday Amma touched his arm lightly. He stopped, but his eyes remained on Malika, full of questions. Questions he did not yet know how to ask. Kwame sat at the table, his posture as composed as always, his expression unreadable, but his mind was not still. It had not been still since the night before. He had not slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. Not just what Malika had done, but how she had done it. Carefully, quietly, almost apologetically. That was what unsettled him the most, because it did not fit the narrative he had been given. It did not fit what he had been warned about. He looked at her now, standing by the table, serving tea, her hands steady, her movements precise, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not been exposed in one of the most vulnerable moments a person could experience. He expected something, an explanation, a defense. But she offered none, only silence, and that silence forced him to think, to question, to reconsider. Across the room, Madame Afua watched carefully. She had noticed the shift, not the event itself, but the atmosphere, the tension, the subtle difference in the way people moved. And she did what she always did. She observed, she waited, because in her experience something was always behind a change like this. Later that morning, as Malika cleaned the kitchen, Madame Afua stepped in quietly. Her eyes scanned the room, the counters, the trays, the storage, everything in place, everything as it should be. But something did not sit right. "Come here," she said. Malika turned. Yes, Madame Afua walked toward the covered trays from the previous night. She lifted one, then another. Her expression tightened slightly. "Was everything disposed of?" she asked. Malika's chest tightened. "Yes, ma." Madame Afua's eyes narrowed slightly. "There was more food left than this," she said. Malika did not respond immediately, because she understood the question beneath the question. Not about food, about honesty, about trust. "I cleaned everything as instructed," she said calmly. Madame Afua studied her face, looking for something, a sign, a crack, but Malika's expression remained steady, because she had learned something important. When you have nothing, the only thing you can protect is your dignity, and she would protect it, even now, even after everything. Madame Afua said nothing more, but her suspicion did not fade. It deepened, because silence to her was rarely innocent. Upstairs, Amma sat quietly in her room. Her thoughts were not loud, not chaotic, but focused on one thing. Malika. The image from the night before stayed with her, not as something wrong, but as something she did not fully understand. She had seen hunger before, in small ways, in stories, in moments outside the house. But not like that, not close, not real. She stood up slowly, walked toward the kitchen. Malika was there, washing dishes. Amma watched her for a moment, then spoke. "Why didn't you tell us?" Malika paused, her hands still, the water running. Then she turned. "Amma," she said softly. Amma stepped closer. "You were hungry," she continued. "Why didn't you say?" Malika looked at her. Really looked at her. At the innocence, at the honesty, at the question that came without judgment. And for a moment she felt something break again. But this time not from shame, from something else, something deeper. "You have your own things to worry about," she said gently. You should not have to think about mine. Amma frowned slightly. But you take care of us, she said, so we should take care of you. The simplicity of the statement settled heavily. Malika swallowed. That is not how it works, she said softly. Amma shook her head. It should be, she replied. From the doorway, Kwame stood, listening, unseen, and this time the words reached him in a way nothing else had. Because they stripped away everything else, status, distance, assumptions, and left something very simple, very human, care, mutual, uncomplicated, something he had not allowed himself to believe could exist in a space like this. Downstairs, Madame Afua spoke quietly, with Auntie Abena. There is something wrong, she said. Abena raised an eyebrow. What kind of wrong I do not know yet, Madame Afua replied, but I will find out. Abena nodded slowly. Make sure you do, she said, because I do not trust what I cannot see clearly. Back in the kitchen, Malika finished her work, her movements steady, her expression calm. But inside, something was shifting again. Not fear, not panic, but awareness that the moment from the night before was not over. It had only begun, and its consequences were still unfolding, slowly, quietly, but inevitably. Because truth once revealed does not disappear. It spreads, through questions, through suspicion, through understanding, and soon it would demand something from everyone involved. A decision, a judgment, a response. And Malika knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it, with the only thing she had ever truly owned, her dignity. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It never did in a house like Kwame Mensah's, where control was valued above all else, where even conflict wore a calm face before revealing its true weight, and yet, by the time it finally surfaced, it carried something sharper than raised voices, judgment that had already formed, conclusions that had already been decided. It started in the late afternoon. The house was quieter than usual, the children resting upstairs after a long morning, the sunlight stretching across the marble floors in long golden lines, and in the kitchen, Malika Diallo stood alone, finishing her tasks with the same precision she had always maintained, her movements steady, her expression composed, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Malika. The voice came from behind her, firm, measured. She turned slowly. Madame Afua stood at the doorway, Auntie Abena just behind her. Their presence together meant one thing. This was no longer observation. This was action. Yes, Malika replied quietly. Madame Afua stepped forward. We need to speak. Malika nodded. I am here. Abena crossed her arms, her gaze direct, unwavering. There was food missing from last night, she said. The words were simple, but they carried accusation. Malika did not look away. Yes, she said. Madame Afua's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, she repeated. What does that mean? Malika took a slow breath. It means I ate some of it. Silence fell, thick, heavy, because confession, when given without resistance, does not soften judgment, it often sharpens it. Abena let out a short, humorless breath. So it is true, she said. Madame Afua's expression hardened. You took food without permission, she said. In this house that is called stealing. The word landed, hard. Malika's chest tightened, but she did not step back. I did not take it to keep, she said calmly. It was going to be thrown away. That is not your decision to make, Madame Afua snapped. Abena stepped closer. And that is exactly the problem, she added. People who cross small boundaries will cross bigger ones. Malika met her gaze. There was nothing else, she said quietly. Abena's lips pressed together. There is always something else, she replied. Except when people choose not to see it. At the top of the stairs, two small figures stood, listening. Kojo, Amma. They had not been told to come, but they had come anyway, drawn by something in the air, something they could feel but not fully understand. Kojo's voice broke the silence. She was hungry. Everyone turned. Amma stepped forward slowly. She didn't take it like stealing, she said. She was just eating. Madame Afua's expression tightened. "This is not something children should involve themselves in," she said sharply. Amma did not move. "She takes care of us," she said quietly. "She doesn't do bad things." Abena looked at her. "You do not understand what you are seeing," she said. Amma shook her head. "I do," she replied. Kojo stepped beside her. "She didn't even eat a lot," he added. "Just a little." The innocence of their defense filled the room. Not strategic, not calculated, just honest. Kwame entered then, his presence shifting the space immediately. "What is happening?" he asked. Madame Afua spoke first. She admitted to taking food without permission, she said. Kwame's gaze moved to Malika, then to the children, then back to Malika. "You took food?" he asked. Malika held his gaze. "Yes." No explanation, no excuse, just truth. Kwame's jaw tightened slightly. "And why?" The question hung in the air. Malika hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because saying it out loud meant something else. It meant exposing something she had spent her entire life protecting. Her struggle, her lack, her vulnerability. But she had already been seen. There was no hiding left. "I was hungry," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Real, unfiltered. Kwame did not speak immediately, because something about the way she said it made it impossible to dismiss. No performance, no manipulation, just fact. Abena stepped forward. "Hunger does not justify breaking rules," she said firmly. If she needed something, she should have asked. Malika's eyes flickered briefly, then steadied again. "And what would have happened if I asked?" She replied softly. The question landed, unexpected, uncomfortable. Abena did not answer immediately, because the truth was not simple. Kwame looked at Malika again, really looked. At her face, her posture, the way she held herself even now, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. "You should have told me," he said. Malika shook her head slightly. "That is not what I am here for," she replied. The statement carried something deeper, a boundary she had set for herself, a role she had never allowed herself to step outside of. Kwame's expression shifted, because for the first time he saw the full weight of what that meant. Not just an employee, but a person who had learned not to ask, not to need, not to expect. Madame Afua's voice cut through again. "This cannot continue," she said. "If boundaries are not enforced, everything becomes unclear." Abena nodded. "She should be dismissed," she added. The word hung in the air. Final, cold. Kojo's face changed instantly. "No," he said. Amma stepped forward. "You can't send her away," she said quietly, but firmly. "This is not your decision," Abena replied. "It should be," Amma said. The room fell silent again, because her voice, though small, carried something undeniable. Conviction. Kwame closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again. His decision was forming, not from habit, not from expectation, but from something else, something new. "We are not making any decisions right now," he said. Madame Afua frowned. "Sir, I said not now," Kwame repeated. His tone was firm, final. Abena studied him. "You are making a mistake," she said. Kwame did not respond, because for the first time he was not sure what the correct decision looked like anymore, only that the usual one did not feel right. Malika stood still, her hands at her sides, her expression calm. But inside, everything was unsettled, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not yet been decided. Because uncertainty in a life like hers was often more dangerous than rejection. Kwame turned to her. "Go and rest for now," he said. Malika nodded. "Thank you." She turned, walked out of the kitchen, her steps steady, her back straight, but each step carried something heavier, because this was not over. Not yet. Behind her the house remained still, but the lines had been drawn. The truth had been spoken. And now everything would depend on what came next. The house did not return to normal after the confrontation. Even though the routines resumed, even though breakfast was served, rooms were cleaned and voices remained controlled. Something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something that no one could quite undo. Because once a truth like that had been spoken aloud, it no longer belonged to silence. It lingered in every glance, every pause, every unfinished sentence. Malika Diallo moved through the day as she always did. Careful, precise, composed. But inside she had already begun preparing herself for departure. Not because she had been dismissed, not yet, but because she understood how these things worked. Even if she stayed, things would not be the same. Trust, once questioned, never returned in the same form. And she had never built her life on fragile things. Upstairs, she folded the children's clothes neatly, her hands steady despite the faint tremor that still lingered beneath the surface. Her body not yet fully recovered from days of hunger. Her strength returning slowly, but not completely. Amma sat nearby, watching, quiet as always, but more focused now. "Are you leaving?" she asked suddenly. The question came without warning, but it did not surprise Malika, because children always sensed change before adults admitted it. Malika paused, her fingers resting on the fabric. "I don't know yet," she replied gently. Amma frowned slightly. "I don't want you to go." Malika's chest tightened, not from pain, but from the weight of that simple truth. "I don't want to go, either," she said softly. Amma looked down, her hands curling slightly in her lap. "But people always go," she whispered. The words were quiet, but they carried something deep, something that had been sitting inside her long before Malika arrived. Malika moved closer, slowly, carefully. She placed a hand, lightly over Amma's. "Not everyone leaves the same way," she said. Amma did not respond, but she did not pull away either. Downstairs, Kwame Mensah stood in his study, his usual place of clarity and control. But today, the space did not offer him what it always had. Answers, decisions, direction. Instead, it held questions. Too many, uncomfortable ones. He had spent most of the morning trying to focus on work. Emails, meetings, numbers, things that made sense, things that could be solved. But his mind kept returning to the same moment. Malika, standing in the kitchen, saying I was hungry. The simplicity of it refused to leave him, because hunger in his world had always been an abstract concept, something distant, something that belonged to statistics, to reports, to problems that could be addressed with resources, but not something that existed inside his own home. Not like that, not so quietly, not so close. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Made a decision, not fully formed, but enough. He reached for his phone, made a call. "Find out everything you can about Malika Diallo," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it something else had begun to move. Not suspicion, not anymore. Something closer to responsibility. Outside the mansion, Malika's world was unraveling. When she returned to the compound that evening, the lock was already on the door. Her steps slowed, then stopped. For a moment she stood still, as if her body needed time to accept what her eyes had already seen. The landlord stood nearby, watching. "You were warned," he said. Malika nodded slowly. "I understand." Ibrahima sat on a small stool beside the wall. his body weaker than before, his eyes filled with something he did not say. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Malika moved toward him immediately. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said. She looked at the door, at the lock, then back at him. "We will find somewhere else," she said, her voice steady. Even now, even here, because she had learned something important a long time ago. Panic does not open doors. Only decisions do. She helped him stand, slowly, carefully. They gathered what little they had. A small bag, a few clothes, nothing more. There was nowhere prepared, nowhere waiting, but they moved anyway. Because staying was no longer an option. Night fell quickly. The streets grew quieter, the air heavier. Malika walked with Ibrahima beside her, his steps uneven, her arms supporting him fully, now her own strength. Barely enough, but still holding, still carrying. Because she had always carried more than she should. They found a small space near an unfinished building. Not safe, not comfortable, but sheltered. For now. Malika helped him sit, then lowered herself beside him, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she had been holding back. Her head rested briefly against the wall, her eyes closed, just for a second. But in that second everything caught up. The hunger, the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of everything she had been holding alone. Her breath trembled slightly, but she did not cry, because she had passed the point where tears solved anything. Beside her, Ibrahima leaned slightly against her shoulder. "We will be okay," he said quietly. Malika opened her eyes, looked at him, and for a moment she wished she could believe it as easily as he did. But belief for her had always been tied to reality, and reality was not kind. Not yet. Back at the mansion, Kwame received the report. It was brief, but enough. He read it slowly, every line, every detail, her background, her family, her brother, her financial situation, the missed rent, the lack of food, the truth, unfiltered, undeniable. He lowered the paper slowly, his expression changing. Not dramatically, but deeply. Because what he saw was not failure, not dishonesty, not weakness. It was survival, pure, unadorned. Survival. And for the first time, he understood something he had never needed to understand before. The cost of dignity, the cost of silence, the cost of not asking. He stood up, moved toward the window, looked out into the night, and made another decision, this time clearer, stronger, because some things once understood could not be ignored. Upstairs, Amma sat on her bed, waiting, listening, but the house felt different now, too quiet, too empty. She looked toward the door, as if expecting Malika to walk in, as she always did. But the door remained still, and something inside her tightened, because this time the absence felt real, not temporary, not uncertain, but real. And in that moment she understood something she had not wanted to face. Malika might not come back, and that thought changed everything. Night did not pass gently for anyone in the house or outside it, because some moments divide lives into before and after. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone had stepped into something irreversible. Something that demanded action. Something that would no longer allow silence to stand in place of truth. Malika Diallo did not sleep. The unfinished building offered shelter but not comfort. The concrete floor cold beneath her, the air thick with dust and uncertainty, and beside her Ibrahima's breathing was uneven, shallow in a way that made her chest tighten every time she listened too closely. She sat upright, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on nothing, thinking, calculating, searching for something that still had not appeared. A solution, but every path led to the same place. Nothing. By early morning, Ibrahima's condition worsened. His cough deepened, his body weaker. "Malika," he whispered. She leaned closer immediately. "I'm here." "It hurts," he said softly. Her hands trembled slightly. where he touched his chest. She pressed her lips together. "We need to go to a clinic," she said. He shook his head weakly. "We don't have money." The words settled heavily, but Malika did not respond to them, because she had already decided. Money or not, they were going. She helped him stand, his weight leaning heavily against her. Her own strength stretched thin, but she did not stop, could not stop. They moved slowly through the streets, each step harder than the last. The early morning quiet broken only by distant movement, people beginning their day unaware of the urgency unfolding beside them. At the clinic, the receptionist looked at them briefly, then at their clothes, their condition. "You need to register first," she said. Malika nodded. How much the number was given, and it might as well have been impossible. Malika swallowed. "We will pay," she said. "Please, he needs to be seen." The receptionist hesitated, then shook her head. "We cannot proceed without payment." Malika's chest tightened. "He cannot breathe properly," she insisted. "I understand," the woman replied. "But these are the rules. Rules, always rules." Malika looked down at Ibrahima. His eyes were closing slightly, his breathing more labored. Something inside her broke. Not her dignity, not her will, but the last barrier between asking and refusing to ask. She turned, stepped outside, looked around. People passed, busy, focused, unaware. She hesitated. For a moment, just a moment. Then she spoke. "Please," she said to a passerby. "Can you help?" The man barely looked at her. Kept walking. Another. Same response. A third. A brief glance. Then nothing. Malika's voice grew softer. But she continued. "Please, he is sick." The words felt heavy in her mouth. Unfamiliar. Because she had not lived this way. Had not asked like this. But now there was no choice left. Inside the clinic, Ibrahima's breathing worsened. Time was moving. Too fast. Across the city, Kwame Mensah sat in his car, driving, not to work, not to a meeting, but somewhere else, somewhere he had never needed to go before. The address from the report, Malika's last known location, but when he arrived, the door was locked. The neighbors spoke. "She left last night," where they shrugged. "Don't know." Kwame's jaw tightened. He turned back to his car, his mind racing now, because something had shifted fully inside him. This was no longer curiosity, no longer observation. This was urgency. Back at the clinic, Malika knelt beside Ibrahima, her hands holding his, her voice steady despite everything. "You will be okay," she said. But this time even she could hear the uncertainty in her words. A shadow fell across them. She looked up. A man stood there. Older. Quiet. He had been watching. He reached into his pocket. Pulled out money. Not much, but enough. "For the boy," he said simply. Malika's eyes widened slightly. "I thank you," she said. No long speech, no explanation. Because in moments like this, gratitude did not need decoration. She rushed inside, paid. The process began, slow, but moving, and for the first time that morning, something shifted. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. Outside, the man who had helped walked away, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but his action remained. Inside the clinic, Ibrahima was taken in. Malika sat in the waiting area, her body finally still, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes unfocused. Because when movement stops feeling, returns. And what returned now was everything she had been holding back. The fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. Her breath trembled slightly, but she remained upright. Because she had not come this far to collapse now. Outside, a car pulled up. Kwame stepped out, his eyes scanning quickly, searching, because something inside him had refused to stay still, had refused to let this end quietly. He entered, looked around, then saw her, Malika, sitting, still, tired, but present. He approached slowly. She did not notice at first. Her mind elsewhere, her body still catching up. Malika, she looked up. For a moment she did not react, as if her mind needed time to place him in this reality. "Sir," she said softly. Kwame looked at her, not as an employer, not as someone above, but as someone who had finally seen clearly. "What happened?" he asked. Malika hesitated, then answered, "My brother is sick." Kwame nodded. "I know." The words surprised her. He continued, "I should have known sooner." Malika said nothing, because she did not know how to respond to that. Kwame looked toward the hallway where Ibrahima had been taken. "Is he being treated?" "Yes," she said, "because someone helped." Kwame's expression shifted slightly. He understood, without needing more. He sat down beside her, not close, but not distant, and for the first time there was no barrier between them that was built on role or expectation. "Only reality." "I am sorry," he said. Malika looked at him, really looked, because apology from someone like him was not something she had expected. "You did not do this," she replied. Kwame shook his head slightly. "I allowed it," he said. The distinction mattered, more than he had ever realized before. Silence settled between them, but this time it was different. Not heavy, not tense, just real. And in that moment something shifted fully, not just in circumstance, but in understanding. Because for the first time they were no longer standing on opposite sides of a line, they were standing in the same reality, and that changed everything. Morning did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if the world itself understood that what had shifted the night before could not be rushed into resolution, because some changes required time to settle, to be understood, to be accepted, not just by circumstances, but by the people living inside them. Malika Diallo remained seated in the clinic hallway, long after Ibrahima had been taken in her body, still her mind slowly catching up with everything that had happened, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily against her. But beneath that weight, something unfamiliar had begun to emerge. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. Beside her, Kwame Mensah sat in silence, his usual distance, replaced by something far more present, far more grounded. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking in terms of control or solutions alone. He was thinking in terms of people, of impact, of the quiet consequences, of what had been allowed to exist, unnoticed under his own roof. The doctor approached them after what felt like hours. "He will be stable," he said, "but he needs proper treatment, consistent care, and time." Malika closed her eyes briefly. A slow breath left her. "Thank you," she said softly. The doctor nodded. He was brought in just in time. Just in time. The words echoed, because Malika knew how close they had been to something else, something she refused to fully imagine. Kwame stood. "I will arrange everything," he said. Malika looked up immediately. "No," she said gently. Kwame paused. "You do not have to refuse," he replied. "I am not refusing help," she said. "I am refusing to become dependent in a way I cannot sustain." Her words were calm, measured, but firm. Kwame studied her, and in that moment he understood something deeply important. This was not pride, not the kind that pushes people away. This was dignity, the kind that protects a person from disappearing inside someone else's power. He nodded slowly. "Then we will do this properly," he said. Malika did not respond immediately, because she was not used to hearing words like that. Not in this way, not directed toward her. "What do you mean?" she asked. Kwame met her gaze. "I mean support that does not take your independence," he said, "and accountability that includes me." The second part surprised her more than the first. Accountability. From him. It changed something. Not everything, but something. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere had shifted as well. Amma sat quietly at the breakfast table, her eyes distant, her hands resting still beside her plate. Kojo looked around. "Where is Malika?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Auntie Abena stirred her tea slowly. "She has her own life," she said. "She cannot always be here." Amma's eyes lifted. "But she said she would come back," she said. Abena did not respond, because certainty in her view was not something to offer lightly. The door opened. Kwame entered. Alone. Amma stood immediately. "Where is she?" Kwame walked toward her. "She is at the clinic," he said. Amma's expression changed. "Is she okay?" "Yes," he replied. "Her brother is sick." Amma's hands tightened slightly. "Can we go see her?" Kwame hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Abena watched the exchange, her expression unreadable, but her silence this time carried something different. Not resistance, but reconsideration. Because even she could see that something had shifted beyond control. Later that day, when Malika returned briefly to the mansion to gather a few of her belongings, she did not expect what she found. Amma ran toward her immediately, not stopping, not hesitating, her arms wrapped tightly around her. "You came back," she said. Malika froze for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace. "I said I would," she replied softly. Kojo joined them, smiling, relieved. "You scared us," he said. Malika smiled faintly. "I am sorry." Kwame stood nearby, watching, not interrupting, because some moments did not need guidance, they needed space. Madame Afua remained at a distance, observing, her expression softer than before, because even she, in her own way, had begun to see something she had not allowed herself to consider, that not all boundaries were broken out of disrespect. Some were crossed out of survival, and survival did not always fit neatly into rules. Auntie Abena stepped forward slowly, her gaze fixed on Malika. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Abena said, "You should have spoken." Malika nodded. "Yes." Abena studied her, "And I should have asked." The admission was small, but significant. Malika did not respond with words, but her expression softened slightly. Because understanding, even when it came late, still mattered, Kwame stepped forward. "I would like you to return," he said. The room fell quiet. Malika looked at him, her expression calm, but thoughtful. "Not as before," he added. She waited. "Under conditions that respect you," he continued. "Clear structure, fair support, no assumptions." Malika considered this carefully, because returning was not simple. It meant stepping back into a space that had changed, but so had she. "And my brother?" she asked. "He will receive care," Kwame said, "through a system that you are part of, not dependent on." The distinction mattered. Malika nodded slowly. "Then I will return," she said. Amma smiled immediately. Kojo cheered softly. Kwame exhaled. Not relief, but something close. Because this was not a solution imposed. It was one built together. In the weeks that followed, the mansion changed. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Food was no longer wasted without thought. Processes were adjusted. Awareness grew, not out of obligation, but understanding. Malika's role evolved, not just as a caregiver, but as someone whose voice carried weight, whose presence was acknowledged fully. Amma healed slowly. Kojo remained bright, and Kwame learned something he had never needed to learn before. That care was not something you hired. It was something you recognized, and protected, and respected. Malika did not become something else. She remained who she had always been, strong, quiet, resilient. But now she was no longer unseen, and that made all the difference. Some people who wear clean clothes speak softly and move with quiet discipline, yet behind that calm surface, they carry struggles the world never stops to ask about. Hunger does not always look desperate. Sometimes it looks like dignity. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it stands right in front of us unseen, because we never thought to look closely enough. Malika's story reminds us that kindness is not only about giving when it is easy, but about understanding, before we judge, about asking before we assume, and about recognizing that survival can push even the strongest people to the edge of choices they never wanted to face. True compassion is not charity that creates dependence, but support that restores dignity and builds strength. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever misjudged someone without knowing their full story? Or have you ever carried a burden in silence, hoping someone would see? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that matter. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity.